I was interested in getting two comments on the feedback here. One from Steve Gillam. Hold on, you say that the BBC quoted Barclays. Barclays are saying that their Barclays call centres are open all weekend, yet you blame the BBC for quoting what Barclays says. Even if people called the BBC to say that Barclays call centres were not open, the BBC was only quoting what Barclays had said. I would imagine that 100,000 people called Barclays, so even if Barclays call centre was open all weekend and fully staffed at very short notice, that even that was not enough, so people may have received the recorded message. Maybe Barclays took the decision to ask people to call back in the week instead of people holding on the phone for hours on end waiting for support. I'm sure that each person impacted would not be a quick 5-minute call, so I imagine that 100,000 calls to complain the support team was working flat out. I'm surprised this type of thing doesn't happen more often. Upgrading any live computer system with so many interlinking systems nowadays, it is like changing an entire airplane mid-flight. Businesses have built these very complicated systems on a shoestring to keep the shareholders happy, but the customer suffers when something goes wrong. Well, absolutely, I agree with you. There are many explanations as to why the call centres may not have been accessible. But at the same time, the BBC, well, I'll deal with this in a minute. There's also a message from Ken Broadbent who says, do we have to call for the BBC funding to end just because there's one episode of lazy journalism? I have 7 accounts with Barclays, including 4 business accounts. I was impacted as anyone, but saying suffered too much. Talk about first world problems. Well, the core issue at hand is the discrepancy between Barclays' claim, as reported by the BBC, and its call centres, that its call centres were open all weekend, and the actual experience of customers who, upon calling, encountered messages stating that the lines were only open during the week. And I was one of those people, so I know exactly what I heard. I was on the phone for 5 minutes going through various permutations of trying to access support, and eventually I got through to be transferred to an agent, and it said that this office is closed from until Monday to Friday. It couldn't be any clearer, and then the phone went dead. If Barclays genuinely had phone support running over the weekend, but was simply overwhelmed by call volumes, it might have chosen to implement an automatic message advising customers that it was, in fact, open during the weekend and we should call back later. That would technically mean the support was open but effectively inaccessible. But that's not what I heard. And if the phone system explicitly stated that the lines only operated from Monday to Friday, then Barclays' claim was demonstrably false. And the BBC, in merely parroting Barclays' position, engaged in poor journalism by failing to verify their claim. And more than that, other media have reported quite accurately that Barclays was inaccessible. The BBC's role as a news organisation is to critically examine claims, not just to repeat them. If multiple customers experienced a different reality, hearing a message stating that no service was available, then a responsible report should have acknowledged this discrepancy rather than simply restating Barclays' assertion. The broader issue is whether this reflects a pattern of uncritical reporting by the BBC or just a one-off instance of lax journalism. I'm afraid Ken Broadbent suggests that calling the BBC's funding to be revoked over this was an overreaction. The incident does highlight a fundamental journalistic failing, and it's not the only failing recently of the BBC. The BBC, I wrote to the BBC a while ago because they hijacked somebody else's news report and passed it off effectively as their own. What they did was to repeat, was to refilm a report that had already been posted on YouTube. I thought that was extraordinarily duplicitous. The phrase first world problem is often used to suggest that an issue is minor in comparison to more severe global crises, famine, war, extreme poverty, and so on. But this argument is problematic when applied to essential services like banking. Reliability is fundamental. A bank exists to provide secure, reliable financial services. If customers are unable to access their funds, make transactions, or even contact support, the problem isn't trivial. It directly impacts their livelihoods, their businesses, and obligations such as rent, payroll, bill payments, and so on. Comparative suffering doesn't negate real suffering. And just because worse problems exist elsewhere doesn't mean that failures in banking infrastructure should be tolerated. The logic that something is not as bad as a war zone doesn't absolve institutions from maintaining basic functionality. They're paid to function properly, and their CEOs are paid a huge amount to function properly. And accountability matters. If Barclays fails to provide the support it promises, and the BBC fails to accurately report on it, these are legitimate issues that warrant scrutiny, regardless of how they rank on the global scale of hardship. A reliable banking system is a non-negotiable component of a modern economy. And whether Barclays fails in service delivery or merely in transparency, or whether the BBC engaged in poor journalism, these are valid concerns that should not be waved away with dismissive platitudes about first world problems. If institutions are not held accountable, standards decline. Standards have declined. And we can look around and start to apportion blame. That isn't a solution. We can say, oh, I blame Putin. Oh, I blame COVID. Oh, I blame Brexit. And now we'll get comments on that. But the real thing isn't who we blame, but how we fix the problem that's occurred. And Barclays, like the BBC, isn't really fixing the problem, is it? If it were fixing the problem, it would be on the phone now, it would be sending messages now. It isn't. It isn't. It's preening itself that it's managed to get over this weekend. Well, getting your boat to a destination is not a cruise, is it? That's a rescue.